this period, you're going to have more and more people who want to have the same benefits of recreation, and they want to do it on an inclusive basis. So that's what we'll talk about. We'll talk about processes that you can use to help make a lawful decision, and importantly, a consistent decision about how you invite, analyze, and provide supports for people with disabilities. I do want to talk a little bit about our current coronavirus or COVID-19 world. Certainly the stay-at-home orders that are advancing to almost every state by now are going to suspend demand for inclusion, but it's not going to end it. I would remind everybody that people with disabilities tend to have underlying health conditions. So as a group, they're probably more likely to be in the more vulnerable category here. I think that has implications for programming. I'm sure many of you are talking about, hey, how can we develop some online-based programs and services? So I would encourage you to do two things here. One, be certain your website is accessible. Many websites are not for a person who is sight impaired, for example. But also, as you're developing programs and services, do consider programs and services for families of kids who have a disability or adults who have disabilities as well. And Chase, that's probably a whole nother session, but I do want to mention it here at the front. Everybody's got this first and foremost on their mind. What we're going to cover until about 11:15 your time is a little walk through the 8-step recreation inclusion process. This is a process that many parks and recreation agencies around the country have used to meet the 35-130D mandate. Sorry for the typo there. And that mandate is that programs must be available in the most integrated setting. I think it's important that you have a process. I know a lot of people are comfortable handling requests as they come in, but having a process makes it more likely that you're going to have a consistent response, and that's important. You want the answer from sports to be the same as the answer from aquatics, and you want that to be the same as the answer from your therapeutic recreation programs or your senior programs or your center programs. So the process helps you do that, but it also gives you the flexibility to adapt. So what is inclusion? Title II actually has a pretty good definition, and it defines it as the setting in which people with and without disabilities interact together. So it's not enough just to have people with and without disabilities in the same room or even in the same program, but instead it's really facilitating participation and interaction between people with and without disabilities. It's important to remember that all of your programs that you offer are indeed open to inclusion. I was talking to a Parks and Recreation director in another state, and she was really proud of the fact that page 16 through 24 of their program brochure listed all of their inclusion programs. And I pulled her aside and corrected her and said, no, that's not really true. From page 1 to page 60 of your program brochure lists all of your programs, and every one of those is open to inclusion. So do draw a line here between all of your programs and your therapeutic recreation programs. They are different indeed. I think it's important when you're talking about this too to realize that you need appropriate professional staff to oversee the process. I'm not going to tell you that there is a one credential that is the only credential, but I'll suggest that the Certified Therapeutic Recreation Specialist credential, or in California, I believe it's a Recreation Therapist Certified credential, is the appropriate place to start. I have seen other disciplines be able to carry this work out. Jamie Hoffman, thank you. Hire CTRS. Indeed, that is the message. I'll tell you that one of the best managers of inclusion that I've ever had, though, was an art therapist that was certified that had been a recreation therapist before. So do get an appropriate professional staff person and start with a CTRS. Remember, too, that you can't require participation in special and adaptive programs instead of inclusive programs. So if I'm a dad of a kid on the autism spectrum and I register him for swim lessons so he can be in lessons with his brother who doesn't have a disability, you can't tell me, oh, we have special swim lessons on Saturday mornings at 7 a.m. I get to pick the program he's in, and as long as there's room and my Visa card doesn't bounce and I registered on time, then my son on the autism spectrum is in that program. The 8 steps in the process are probably things that you're already doing. What we hear from agencies who implement this is that it's unique because they're all strung together in what we hope is a logical order. So the 8 steps that we'll talk about are invitation, number 1. Number 2, the registration process. Number 3, the assessment. Number 4, after the assessment, putting together a plan. Number 5, providing staff training to the employees who are going to implement this. Ongoing communication, which really could have been anywhere throughout, between you, the agency, and the family who's made the request. Of course, the 7th is implementation. Having a plan but not implementing it doesn't really make sense. And then last but not least is evaluating the effectiveness of your plan. So let's jump in and talk first about the first step, which is the invitation. So this is actually, as you see at the bottom of this slide, a requirement. Section 35.106 of the Title II regulation issued by the Department of Justice requires you to make your residents aware of how their civil rights under the ADA are protected. So that sounds a little stilted. Instead, we call this the invitation. So in your materials, both online and print, and in messages that you have, whether it's email blasts or an actual face-to-face conversation that's 6 feet away, you want to say something like, the Green Acre Parks and Recreation Department invites people with and without disabilities to enjoy our programs, parks, and facilities. For more information, call, then name somebody, provide a phone number, or provide an email. This language is just a sample. We would encourage you to use language that fits your own agency culture. But you do want to get the message across that we do want people with disabilities in programs. I think a related issue here is the images that you use online and in print materials. I know that we all try to make sure that we have images of men and women, persons of Hispanic descent, persons of Asian descent, persons of African American descent, the Irish, and so forth. So as you're doing that, maybe make 1 out of every 10, 12, or 15 images an image of a person with a disability participating in your programs. It helps get the message across that not only are you inviting people, but they're actually participating. Process step number 2 is the registration process. So language needs to be on every registration form. So this tends to be a problem where there are decentralized registration systems, but for a centralized system, you need to have language that is something like this. I need a modification because of disability to enjoy this program. There are really only three things that can happen. I say no, which means I purposely am telling you I don't need a modification in the program. I leave it blank, and if that's the case, I should not be able to advance farther. But if it's a print registration, that also means I haven't asked you for support. And best of all worlds is I circle yes or tell you yes. That means before the program starts, I'm telling you that I do need a support because of disability to participate in the program. If you use an online registration system, as I imagine most of you do, your vendor is just waiting for you to call to modify your system so that you have language like this. And do make this one of the questions that must be answered before they can advance farther into the registration process. This too ties directly into the Title II regulation. It connects to the 35.130 requirement that you provide supports. As a part of that, you're supposed to invite people to ask you if they need a support. So this is all consistent with Title II. We do see people do this wrong. Here's an example from New Jersey. There are three things in particular that are wrong with this. In your chat box, tell me if you can figure out what it is, but the statement here is if you require reasonable accommodation for any type of disability in order to participate in City of Green Acre Recreation, please contact Director Dana Black at her phone number. 3 business days advance notice is requested. I'll save you the chat time. First, it fails because you've used the wrong word. Reasonable accommodation is an employment term, and in employment, enforcement is in favor of the employer, not the employee with a disability. The term you should use always is reasonable modification. So if I come in to talk to you about my hypothesized son on the autism spectrum from earlier, and you start talking about making an accommodation, you've already lost credibility with me because I think you don't view this from a Title II prism. Instead, you're looking at it as Title I employment. Why do other people with disabilities have to call the director and people without a disability don't? You don't impose a hoop that people with disabilities have to jump through that others do not have to jump through as well. Last but not least, you cannot require advance notice. You can ask for requests, but don't use the words advance notice. The request for a support logically is going to occur before the program begins. If it doesn't, if the program has already started and you receive a request, explain politely that it may take you pick the number of days, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days to do an assessment. We'll talk about that next. To do an assessment and then put a plan together. And until then, they cannot begin participation. So before we start with assessment, are there any questions from the group regarding the first 2 steps, the invitation and the registration process? All right, I'm not seeing any. We will move to assessment, and we'll start with a short story here. In 1992, Mr. Anderson was the third base coach on a little league team in Scottsdale, Arizona. They had never been able to participate in the state tournament because the team wasn't that good. So I don't know what happened. Maybe a kid from California moved to Scottsdale, but the team got better that year and they qualified for the Arizona Little League state tournament. Mr. Anderson happened to use a wheelchair in the third base box. And Arizona Little League for 2 years had winked at the Little League rule that prohibited anybody from being on the field if they had an orthotic or prosthetic device. Importantly, in the 3 years he had coached, Anderson had never been struck by a batted ball, had never had a collision with a fielder, had never had a collision with a base runner. So that's important as we move into this discussion. I'm not sure who filed the complaint, but maybe it was a coach on another team or a parent on another team. But somebody 4 days before the tournament called Little League USA in Brockport, New York, and complained that Arizona wasn't following all the Little League rules, and they had a guy in a wheelchair on the field. Brockport called Arizona Little League 3 days before the tournament and said, hey, you have to follow all of our rules. And then they proceeded to threaten Arizona Little League. And they told them that if they weren't going to follow all the rules, they would be disenfranchised. They could call themselves Arizona Boys Baseball, but they could not call themselves Little League. So Arizona Little League said, all right, we'll enforce all the rules. So 2 days before the tournament, they call Mr. Anderson up and they tell him he can't be in the third base box. So Mr. Anderson's choices are several. He could say, okay, you're right, I won't be in the box. He could say, no, I'm going to fight this, and he can go to court, which is indeed what he did. At another conference, someone suggested he could have said, you're right, but then on the day of the tournament, wheeled out to the third base box and made Little League drag him off the field. I kind of like that passive approach as well. But instead, he went to court. And in court, I would ask all of you to raise your hand if you know somebody who has a disability that requires them to use a wheelchair. In court, that's pretty much what the judge did. And he said, not all people who use a wheelchair are alike. Therefore, you can have a blanket safety rule, but you must apply it only with the results of an assessment of the person with a disability. So that's important. In 1992, if you work in sports and recreation, conducting an assessment became a part of your job description. A lot of the ADA litigation has a kind of a stupid customer service aspect to it. And certainly we see that in Anderson. Mr. Anderson's day job was that he was the sitting federal district court judge in Phoenix. So, and Arizona Little League knew it. They would call him up and ask him to look at the field use agreement for this jurisdiction and that jurisdiction. So know your customers. The last thing you do is find yourself in court, and knowing your customers and having a good, strong relationship with them is going to help you avoid that. So back to the issue of the assessment. We talked about your professional staff person. So let's say you have a CTRS on staff, then that is the logical person to conduct assessments. But if you don't, barter it. If your neighboring community has a CTRS and you don't, surely there must be something you have that they don't have that you can barter with them and exchange some services, or partner it. In several states, the idea of jurisdictions combining to split the benefits and salary of a CTRS who can then manage their inclusion process has taken hold. It's a very effective model. In some states, it is the dominant model, like Illinois. You very, very rarely see in Illinois a community do this on their own. Instead, they do it together. Just a warning note here. Title II has some really specific requirements if you deny a request for a reasonable modification. So I would ask you, if we were doing a session at the conference, to raise your hand if you do these things, and my guess is very few of you would raise your hand. If you deny a request, what you are required to do is, after you tell the person no, go back to your laptop or your desktop and you hammer out a very short writing, a memo, and it's going to say something like, on April 3rd at 10:15 a.m., I informed John McGovern, who is a participant in our programs, that we would not provide the modification he had requested, and then go ahead and say what the modification is based on disability. Give a brief explanation of why you're not going to provide it, and create this as a risk management document. And this document has to be signed off on by the head of the public entity or his or her designee. We usually suggest that a city manager or county manager or a special purpose district director be the person that is the signer off on, and that they can delegate that to department heads if it's a city or a county. But this is an important piece. If that person that you've denied the request from files a complaint, one of the very first things the court is going to want to see is the writing made by the head of the public entity regarding the denial of that request. I do think this relates to some other documentation issues as well. We always encourage cities and counties and districts to maintain a central log that has limited access. Everybody shouldn't be able to see all of the information in here, but the log should note how many requests for support you've received, what type of support did they ask for, what action did you take, what staff on your team were involved, what were the costs incurred. And then if you did say no, either hyperlink or embed the actual no letter or writing that you're required to create. And we suggest, again, that this be on a centralized basis. If somebody files a complaint against a California jurisdiction, you want to be able to go to one place and see all of the reasonable modification requests and fulfillment without having to go to sports to see theirs, aquatics to see theirs, centers to see theirs, and so forth. So again, centralizing here can make you much, much more efficient from a loss control and a risk management perspective. Do regularly review the log. Treat it as a fire drill if you want, but pull out a particular request and your response to it and analyze it again, because if you've gotten a request once, you're going to get it again. Process step number 4 is the plan. So you've invited me to participate. I have gone through your registration process. You've done an assessment, and now you're going to have to put a plan together. So keys to the plan are what exactly occurs in the program. Are there any prerequisite skills? You can have prerequisite skills. That's an important note, as long as they are applied to everybody. So, for example, I don't know how to swim. If I signed up for a canoeing class, no one's going to know that unless that's part of the registration form or the screening process. So you can have prerequisite skill requirements as long as they are applied equally to people with and without disabilities. I think part of the plan process too is be clear about what the program conduct expectations are. When I worked in Parks and Recreation, we created a document called Playfair, which laid out the steps we would take laid out the steps we expected of the registrant, and laid out the steps that we expected the family of the registrant to take as well. So maybe you don't have to go that far, but we found it to be a very helpful way to get everybody on the same page. Certainly you're going to include in the plan things that relate to what you discovered in the assessment, and you'll talk about the supports that best enable participation. Related to that, I would encourage each department or district to have a really clear list of the types of supports that you will provide and the ones that you will not provide. At the last 15 minutes, we'll talk about typical reasonable modifications to give you some guidance there. I think it's important to ask what generates the best success and what support is least intrusive. You don't want to change the nature of the program, but you do want everybody in the program, including people who don't have a disability, to gain some success in the activity. Importantly, the second to the bottom bullet point, what support is preferred by the registrant should be a factor, but it is not the driving force. If I am deaf or hard of hearing and I use Chase, because I know Chase, as my sign language interpreter, and I say, I want to sign up for your program, but the only interpreter I want to use is Chase, you can tell me no. You can tell me no because you have other interpreters at a lower rate. You can tell me no because you have other interpreters that are available that you're trying to give the hours to. There's no reason for you to solely defer to my decision. Should you consider it? Yes. And there may be times where indeed you say, hey, you know what? We are going to use Chase. But this is a decision that is in your court, and if you are set up with, to stick with the example, another sign language interpreter that you know and have worked at a rate, there's nothing wrong with you using that person. Top bullet point is always something that we hear from agencies. It's kind of a red herring. Does your agency have staff that can provide the selected supports? I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that most of you don't have a sign language interpreter on staff. That doesn't mean that you are unable to provide the supports. You can contract out for this, you can barter. There are a lot of ways that you can get it. So in red there, I said, if you don't, where you can, where can you get them? Because get them, you will. Attitude's a key part here too. Program leaders need to understand that the agency supports inclusive participation and that means it's really a part of their job description too. So let's talk about the fifth step, which is staff training. So you've put the plan together now. Support staff have to know what the plan is and how to implement it. We always encourage that, of course, the staff leading the program undergo the training. But if you're going to provide staff support 1-to-4 ratio or 1-to-1 ratio, that obviously those employees need to be trained about the particulars of the plan as well. I do think other staff, such as facility supervisors or department heads, need to have an awareness of the plan, but not necessarily the detail of the plan. And do remember that you have an obligation to protect the right to privacy. We had a situation when I worked in Parks and Recreation where 2 of our staff left after a particularly difficult day with a participant, and were in the checkout line at a local grocery store. And like all of us do, they were talking about their work day, and they mentioned the name of the boy that had had a particularly difficult day. In line behind them was the boy's grandmother. So that was a very bad incident and a great reminder to us about encouraging staff to remember to protect the right to privacy of our registrants. So step 6 is ongoing communication. This really could have gone anywhere here, but I've put it here. We would encourage staff at your agency, once you have a plan and you've trained staff, to reach out to the registrant and talk about what the plan is going to include, and if necessary, introduce the support staff. If you're hiring somebody to work on a 1-to-4 ratio or a 1-to-1 ratio or a 1-to-2 ratio, consider giving them the phone number or email for the family and encouraging them to reach out. We did that when we were placing support staff for inclusion. We would have the staff reach out to the family, and it goes a long way to making the family trust you. Families are really taking a big leap when they put their son or daughter or husband or wife or brother or sister in one of your programs if it's the first time they've ever done it. So taking steps like this can really help you build a rapport with the family. Again, do document your decisions and your communications. We found that the average number of times we reached out to a person before they registered was 71 times. Now that included email, that included parent-teacher meetings, that included letters, that included sending them a brochure, that included meeting them at a site so that they could see where the activity would occur. But that was helpful to us from a planning perspective. So it told us we needed an outreach coordinator to take the load of some of this communication off of the direct recreation providing staff. The 7th step is implementation. So you're probably thinking, gee, do we really need to mention that? And I'm going to encourage you to do that. We had a CPRS on staff who led our plan development for a particularly difficult 22-year-old who weighed about 220 pounds and was on the autism spectrum. And when he became frustrated, he would flail his arms, push people away. And both of his parents were MDs, so he was in 25 of our programs every week. So we needed a really comprehensive support plan for him. The young man was also contact aversive, so we had a great plan that steered him in a way by putting staff between him and an object. And one day, we don't quite know why it happened, our full-time professional staff member reached out to redirect him by touching him on the back of his left elbow. So that left elbow wound up striking our staff member in the face and knocking out his 2 top front teeth. We didn't suspend the participant. We thought the issue here was solely because our staff member who had created the plan didn't follow the plan. So it's really important to, again, get the message across that the plan is important. It's something you've professionally prepared, and it does need to be followed. Certainly, in every recreation environment, we're accustomed to having plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, plan E, and we're certainly seeing that recently with the COVID-19 circumstances. So we encourage you to make sure your staff do have alternatives and can adapt the plan comfortably and effectively and safely. I would suggest here too that funding through a central line item for modifications is really important. We've served about 390 Parks and Recreation departments from California to Connecticut. And in our experience, if a center director or an aquatics facility manager or a golf course manager, if they have to take the funding for the reasonable modifications out of their operating budget, they are more likely to say no to the request. On the other hand, if there is some type of a central line item that can pay for sign language interpreters or extra staff, the facility operator or program manager is more likely to say yes. This is a critical problem for cities and counties and districts. If you have a program budget, you can't use the program budget as the reason for saying that a modification costs too much. Instead, you have to look at the division the program is in, then the department in which that division is in, then the city or the county or the entire special district that that department is in, and contrast the cost of the modification to the overall operating budget for a city or a county. It is very, very difficult. In fact, I've not seen it once. It is very difficult to justify not making a modification solely because of cost. Again, centralizing this information helps you from a risk management perspective, but I think it really helps you make consistent decisions as well. So the 8th step, no surprise, is an evaluation. We encourage you to use both formative and summative evaluation processes. There's no better time to change the way you're implementing a plan than while the program is still underway. So formative evaluations can really be helpful here. Same for a summative evaluation. After your program has completely ended, cast a wide net and ask, of course, the family and the registrant for some evaluation remarks, but ask others who were involved. Ask the staff who supported the person with a disability. Ask facility management staff who hosted the programs, and get wide feedback and use it to make your plan better. And by that I mean more safe or more effective the next time around. All right, we're just about halfway through, and we're going to start walking through what is a reasonable modification, but this is a good time to stop and ask if there are questions or comments about the 8 steps. Chase, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. I'm seeing the chat box, but I don't see any questions here.
And I was muted. Good time to remind folks, yeah, if you have any ongoing questions, use that chat box, but no, nothing has trickled in. I think folks are just paying attention.
All right. Well, let's jump into defining what is a reasonable modification. And first, I'm going to make a suggestion here. None of us are members of Congress, and none of us probably want to be a member of Congress either. So don't get hung up on the word reasonable in this phrase. In fact, from here on out, I'm going to refer to modifications as supports. There's really no sense in focusing on the word reasonable because it's already been defined. It's been defined by Congress. It's been defined by the Department of Justice in the Title II regulation that applies to every city, state, county, and special purpose district. And it's been defined as well in court decisions and settlement agreements. So calling it supports is a little bit more user-friendly as opposed to reasonable modification, which sounds a little bit legalistic, and you just don't need to go there with your registrants at this point. So what we've done, and this comes from my experience in Parks and Recreation, two of my other coworkers worked in Parks and Recreation for a long time as well. We've cut supports up into 3 categories. It's important to note these aren't static. Each of these categories is changing. In fact, before you all got on, Chase and I were talking, and I made an edit to one of the slides, and I'll point it out when we get to it. So we call these mandated supports. These are supports that you're going to have to provide because you're required to do so by statute, court decision, or regulation. Personal supports, a little bit more of a gray area, but there's also a fair amount of evolving debate regarding some of those. And then medical and quasi-medical supports is the 3rd category. Going back to a remark I made earlier, I think that whether you choose to use the words that I'm suggesting here or you come up with your own, it's important that your staff know what supports your jurisdiction will provide and which supports right now you're not prepared to provide. So trying to, again, address this issue of consistency, you want your staff to know that this decision has already been made. So let's jump in and talk about mandated supports. And we've got a couple slides here. All right, so again, these are things that the agency has to provide. First is changes to rules and policies. There's a Chicago Park District decision right now where a gentleman with a post-traumatic stress disorder like health condition, Mr. Mail, wanted to bring a guinea hog to Chicago Park District sites and facilities. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with a guinea hog, but Mr. Mail's guinea hog weighs about 200 pounds and is about 36 to 38 inches high from the ground and is, how should I say it, broad at the beam. The Park District was concerned about the safety of a guinea hog in crowded Chicago Park District sites, so they just flat out said no. They didn't analyze it from the perspective of changes to rules and policies. So Mr. Mail went to court and he has won the first round. And the Chicago Park District is going to have to address this from the perspective of changes to rules and policies. Now, that doesn't mean that Mr. Mail has won, period, but it means the Park District is going to have to go back and discuss why making this change and allowing a guinea hog at sites is a fundamental alteration. I'm going to go back to address a question that is in the chat box. If you say no to a modification request due to struggling budget, lack of CPRS leaders, etc., how does the organization prevent potential lawsuit even with all the documentation that was kept? Pretty common circumstance. I think the struggling budget issue is different than the lack of CPRS leaders. So let's address the budget issue first. If I'm a city, and I realize that some of you on this webinar don't have the authority to make this call, but if I'm a city and the city manager has just left to take a job in Arizona and there are $10,000 in salary savings in the city manager's office, the city is going to have to be the one that justifies why some of that $10,000 can't be used to fund the reasonable modification of an extra staff person in a recreation program. So I'm not sure that city administrators and county administrators and special purpose district administrators are all clear on that concept. So it's really important that the budget issue be one that is examined with the entire budget in mind, not just the program budget. As to lack of CTRS leaders, that is a problem. I would encourage you to do the next best thing. If you can't find a CTRS, find somebody who knows Parks and Recreation and disability. If you can't find that, can you reassign a current staff member who knows the person? So take as many steps down as you can until you empty the well of possibilities. And if then you need to say no, then go ahead and say no. As far as can you prevent the potential lawsuit, again, I think outreach, having a good relationship with your disability communities, it's not just one community, that's a good way for you to make friends in the disability community. I think an advisory council is another really effective idea. If I live in your community and I have a disability and I'm on your advisory council and I see all the work that you're doing and how hard you're trying, I'm a lot less likely to wheel into federal district court. Somebody else asked about, is it advisable to put the modification line item in the general budget rather than under the Parks and Rec budget? And the answer, of course, is yes. You want police, fire, public works, code enforcement. Everybody should be able to draw on this and use the line item. And oh my gosh, it's even better if it's centralized within the entire jurisdiction, because then I don't have to go from department to department. There's a comment as well from a poster who says there are many new grads and alumni who are hungry to work in municipal parks and recreation who are CTRSs. If that poster would give me consent to say her name, then we'll encourage everybody to reach out to you. I think we mentioned this in the beginning. All of the chat comments are going to be sent to me by Chase, and I'm going to turn them around into an FAQ document that we can get out to everybody. And Jamie Hoffman has agreed that yes, we can mention her name, and I think you all see the post there too. All right, there's a comment as well about RTCs, and they can work as needed on a consulting basis, and indeed that is the case. We have, with our staff who includes a CTRS, for some cities who can't find a CTRS, we have filled in and helped them with assessments. So I think there's a pretty significant market here. Chase, I don't know the CPRS setup. I don't know if there is a member group within CPRS that is only including people who are recreation therapists. But if there is, that's, certainly okay. And I see Jamie commenting that there is an RT section.
Yep, that was going to be my comment as well.
All right, so certainly this is an opportunity for RTs to get the word out to cities that don't have an RT, or to counties that don't have an RT on staff, simply from the perspective of, we can help you meet your ADA obligation to provide services in the most integrated setting. Happy to talk about that more. Chase, that's probably another session as well. So back to mandated supports. Changes to rules and policies. We talked about mail. So don't do that. Don't make the assumption that you don't have an obligation to change your rules and policies. You do. It's in black and white in the statute. It's in black and white in the regulation. Most changes to rules and policies are easy to make in the sense that they don't cost money. So that's an important piece that you should be able to flex on. Another is acquiring and providing adaptive equipment. I'm going to talk about two decisions here. Both involve adaptive golf cars. Indy Parks, Indianapolis Parks and Recreation in Indiana, was one of the early settlement agreements. And the settlement agreement requires every one of the city's 9 golf courses to have at least 2 adaptive golf cars. In every court decision regarding adaptive golf, the number has been 2 adaptive golf cars. So that's certainly what I would encourage California agencies that have a golf course or operate a golf course or have a management firm operate the golf course. Aim for a minimum of 2. Marriott is a really interesting decision as well. A little bit of a story here. 3 retirees in Philadelphia decide they want to golf on the Marriott courses that scattered through California and some of the other western states. So there's 26 such courses. They're pretty high-end courses. You'd recognize the names if you, like me, cheat at golf as well. They called to make a reservation at the first one, made their tee times, then told the guy, hey, by the way, we all use wheelchairs, so we'll want to use adaptive cars. And the person on the other end of the line at the golf course said, well, we don't provide those, but we will change our rules and policies. If you want to ship your adaptive golf car here, we'll let it sit in the parking lot, and then you can go out on our golf course in your golf car. Well, that's not a real effective solution. I'm sure the gentleman wanted to golf before their trip to California, so shipping them to California didn't make any sense at that point. So they called the next course. They got the same answer. They called the next course. They got the same answer. So they went to federal district court. By the way, again, another bad customer service issue here. All 3 of these guys, these retirees, were lawyers. So the last thing you want is 3 retired lawyers suing you. In court, the cost of the adaptive golf car that the gentlemen were seeking the use of was around $10,000. The court wound up agreeing and said that at all 26 of these Marriott courses, 2 of these $10,000 golf cars, so if you can do the math, that's $520,000, needed to be available. Many golf courses that do this also have a pooling agreement. So if I go to golf at golf course A and I bring 3 of my friends in wheelchairs and your course only has 2, then golf course A calls golf course B, and the 2 single rider cars, assuming they're available, are shipped over and then trucked back later after we use them. So there's a good smart practice here of combining techniques. Just to give you a sense of another, I'm going to call it a bad decision. I mentioned the $520,000. Marriott spent at least $3.5 million in legal fees. So it's not uncommon in federal district court to see the cost of the modification or support be far exceeded by the legal fees incurred. Remember, you're not just paying your attorney. If you lose an ADA complaint, you're going to pay the legal fees for the person who's filed the complaint as well. Next on the mandated support list is providing a lower staff ratio. There's quite a few decisions here. Pocantico Hills in New York, where the request was for a 1-to-1 ratio. Burriola out of Ohio, where the request was for staff to get extra training. Barrington in Illinois, which was a request for a 1-to-1 ratio. There are probably 12 to 15 YMCA decisions. If you go to the Department of Justice website, which is www.ada.gov, it's on the last page of our handout here. In the upper right, there's a search box. Just type in YMCA, and you will see every settlement agreement against a YMCA from New York to California. New on the list is ANOVA. ANOVA is an education agency, but they're going to have, I think, pretty considerable application to Parks and Recreation services. ANOVA was required to provide a behavioral support plan. So that is a really common way of supporting persons with disabilities in Parks and Recreation and therapeutic recreation programs. I'm sure every CTRS or RTC, on the call here is familiar with this issue. So don't overlook behavioral supports. Other mandated supports include auxiliary aids and services like a sign language interpreter. There's a great decision about a wrestler who was deaf who managed in matches by having an interpreter literally on the mat signing to him what his coach was encouraging him to do from a maneuver perspective. So there are probably hundreds of decisions about providing sign language interpreters. If you get a request for this, you're going to wind up providing an interpreter. We talked about the ANOVA behavior plan issue. If you're curious, it's in the Department of Justice website under their settlement agreements, and it's spelled out clearly in clause 14. New that I added this morning are providing medical marijuana or CBD oil for persons who have a disability. If I have a 5-year-old who has cancer and they're receiving treatment, they may indeed have pretty considerable pain. Both marijuana and, oddly enough, I'm going to say CBD oil do have scholarly research that shows the benefit, the therapeutic benefit of both. So we have Parks and Recreation clients from coast to coast who have already told us that they're getting requests to hold and dispense medical marijuana or CBD oil for persons with disabilities that are registered in their program. When I was at the California conference a couple of weeks ago, I talked about this with a handful of people. Some had not heard this at all. Some had said, yes, we've gotten that request. So at the very least, because this can be a touchy issue, this is something that you need to have an answer to sooner rather than later. And by that, I mean before you get the request. So bring it up back in the office and find out whether or not, find out what your jurisdiction's approach is going to be to holding medical marijuana or CBD oil and presenting it for a person with a disability. Personal supports is one of the evolving areas. So, and I've listed a handful here. Changing clothes of a registrant who can't do it because of their disability for programs like swimming or fitness. Holding and providing prescription medicine. I believe a lot of you already do that. Certainly therapeutic recreation staff do. California, like most states, allows the delegation of nursing tasks like holding and providing prescription medicine to an employee who has been trained by a nurse. So this becomes a training issue, and I'm going to say nothing else. It's something that is commonly done in almost all of the 50 states. So if you're not doing this, I would encourage you to talk to the therapeutic recreation or the RT section and find out who you can talk to in California that is doing this and use some of their same protocols. Hygiene support or toileting, and I don't mean here making sure that my wheelchair is close enough to the toilet that I can transfer onto it. I mean assistance with wiping. I mean assistance with aiming. I mean assistance with emptying. So these are very personal supports. I think if you asked most people in Parks and Recreation, they would say that they didn't think that was going to be in their job description. So again, this is an area where we see a lot of agencies doing this. We also see a lot of agencies not doing it. I think it's important to have this discussion internally about what your approach is going to be. I would caution you that if you're a city or a county or a special district and you have therapeutic recreation staff, I'm going to bet that 90% of the time, those staff are already providing toileting assistance or hygiene support. That means the city is. That means the county is. In other words, therapeutic recreation doesn't exist on its own in a separate bubble. They are a part of your Parks and Recreation department, whether you're a city or a county or a district. So I do encourage you here to do a survey. Find out from line staff with no penalty for being truthful what kind of modifications staff and supports staff are providing in programs. Lastly here, feeding through a feeding tube, it's not complex. In fact, all of these tasks, changing clothes, holding and providing prescription medicine, hygiene support, feeding through a feeding tube, these are lay tasks. These are done at home in your community probably 500 times a day, depending on your size, more often than that as well. One of the ones that's evolving again also is medical or quasi-medical supports. We're down to like the last 10 minutes here, Chase, if I'm looking correctly. This might include removing or inserting a feeding tube. I think that that is something that does require a little bit more training, and I'd call it a quasi-medical support. The second bullet point is important. Injecting insulin or other medicine. This is a mandated requirement in a number of settlement agreements. Little Einstein is a series of Title III privately owned for-profit child care centers. Again, YMCAs have been wrapped up into this, as well as other agencies. So the typical language in the settlement agreements is that agency staff will conduct assessments, and agency staff, if it is determined to be necessary, will train their staff on how to administer insulin by syringe, pump, or other methods. So think about your own agency, your city or your county or your district. How will you respond if this request comes in? Because right now the handwriting on the wall is that the Department of Justice believes this is a support you have to provide. Last but not least, and there's a little disagreement here, is rectal administration of anti-seizure medication. The United States sued an Illinois municipal service provider that was refusing to do that for 2 girls that were registrants in their program, and both had cluster seizures. Long story short, the court held that the US had not proven that it was a reasonable modification. Note that I said US had not proven it. They did not say that NISRA had satisfactorily proven that it was a fundamental alteration. So I think in a post-COVID-19 world that this will be a lawsuit that comes up again. California often leads in areas related to delivery of services. I wouldn't be surprised to see this as a California federal district court lawsuit. The controversy here is that in settlement agreements, the Department of Justice is requiring it. So there's a settlement agreement with the YMCA that requires rectal administration of anti-seizure medication. There's a settlement agreement with a private for-profit camp operator that requires the same. So my caution to you here is to stay current on technology. I think a lot of people would say, I didn't think rectal administration of anti-seizure medication is in my job description either, but technology has changed. There is now a nasal spray that accomplishes the same thing. You can spray it into the person's nose or their mouth while they're in the middle of the seizure, and it delivers the anti-seizure medication. So that's very, very different than inserting it rectally. So staying current on treatment and trends in disability will serve you well in the future. Couple of court decisions. Some of these I've referenced. Burriola versus Greater Toledo YMCA was a 1-to-1 and staff training dispute regarding a boy on the autism spectrum in an after-school program. Barrington Mansfield area YMCA is a DOJ settlement agreement regarding staff as well as training and diabetes. Barrington, Illinois is a decision out of the U.S. Department of Interior regarding the cost of modifications. One of you asked earlier about cost, and I should have picked that up. Barrington did the right thing. They did an assessment by a CTRS. They decided to provide a 1-to-1 staff, and halfway through the year, the finance superintendent for the district, in meeting with the recreation superintendent, said, hey, your numbers look great in your after-school program. Your income is good, but your expenses are really high. Why is that? And they said, well, remember, we're providing a 1-to-1 staff member for that one boy. And the finance superintendent told the recreation superintendent they had to let that employee go. So I want to say here, don't let finance drive the bus. This is a modification or support question, not an income and expense issue. So Barrington let the staff person go. You can all predict what happened to the boy's behavior. The park district called the mom up. By the way, it's often the mom that presses the issue here. The park district called the mom up and said, hey, we're kicking your son out with 1-day notice from our program. So don't find yourself in that boat. Again, maintaining a good relationship with your communities of people with disability are really important. And don't let this be a decision that you make just because of dollars. Pocantico Hills, New York, that too was a decision based on dollars. The family asked for a 1-to-1. The registrar for the program wrote on a Post-it note, mailing their registration form and check back, that the agency could not provide a 1-to-1. They lost, and they wound up having to provide it. Last but not least is a KinderCare settlement. As you know, KinderCare is a big nationwide private for-profit child care provider, and part of their settlement agreement changes the way they address kids who have a disability. It also puts them in the horrible position of any time a KinderCare says no to a request for a modification by a parent of a kid with a disability, they have to notify the Department of Justice that they've said no. So none of you want to be in that kind of a situation. How do you avoid that? Have your centralized line item, get your staff trained, create this process, and lean towards yes more often than no. Handful of resources here. I'm happy to stick around after the call, Chase, if we can do that, and answer any other questions that people have. The Department of Justice, don't get me wrong, DOJ right now has a whole bunch of things on its plate, but they are still providing good technical assistance, and they've gained a better understanding of recreation operations. They have a hotline that you can call. I've found it to be fairly effective. They also have a number of, at their website, technical assistance documents that are related to local government in general. There's not anything specific to recreation aside from an aquatics guideline, but they're a good source to go to if you have questions about, I'll say, programs and policies. The National ADA Network, and I gave you their link and their phone number. They're also good on questions regarding programs and policies and facilities. They're not as authoritative as the federal government, but nonetheless, they're a good resource. I love talking about this. Feel free to reach me by phone. Yes, that's my desk phone. I will see it on my cell phone. Or feel free to reach me by email, and I promise you I will respond. Heidi Lappin on our team is one of our project managers. She has a lot of local government experience, including time as a Department of Parks and Recreation director and as director of a special purpose district. So you can reach her at her desk and she too will see it, or feel free to email her. I think I would ask, just so Chase is familiar with requests, that if you do email us a request, and I'm really inviting you to do that, that you copy Chase just so he can see who's asking and what they're asking. It might help in developing content for a webinar in the future. And my watch says 11:14. Like I said, I'm happy to stick around here. I see a handful of other questions.
Yeah, we got a lot of folks saying, thank you for their time and expertise, and I will join them in saying that. And then, yeah, anybody who needs, let me post real quick here. We've got a CEU survey that will be in the chat. There's a Survey Monkey link. It might get lost in my little paragraph there, but anybody who needs anything can reach out to me, chase@cprs.org, and that does include for a copy of this presentation. So we will be offering all of our recordings as well as the chat, FAQ, all of the stuff we talked about today. That will eventually go up on our CPRS website, but we do have a few other things to take care of first, just like everybody else, so that may be a while. So if you do want the PowerPoint sooner than that, you can email me and I will send that out to you. And then, yeah, any other questions or comments, let me know. We'll keep everything open for a few minutes here.